The snow had begun to fall in a fine, patient sheet when she arrived 10 minutes early and heard the sentence that would break everything. "You are pregnant," spoken with a softness that mocked the years she had believed in. The living room smelled of pine and rich perfume. The chandelier sent tiny stars across the crystal glasses, and the carol playing too loud on the stereo folded into the background until the three words cut through like a bell. Claire Langley, Chief Investment Officer at a boutique family office, accustomed to negotiating billion-dollar deals and reading the fine print of complex acquisitions with the same calm she used to hold a glass, felt the heat drain from her face and the plastic of the champagne flute grow suddenly heavy in her hand. She stood in the entryway for a breath that felt like an accusation, the carpet under her heels muffling the laughter, the taste of copper rising in her throat, and in that precise suspended second she understood that the private ledger of her life had been balanced against a different account. The marriage had been documented with prenuptial agreements, with transfers and agreements and the careful allocation of equity that her brain had once admired as elegant architecture. That architecture had been verbalized into warmth and promises and late-night plans, but tonight it was a structure someone else had found an access door into. She did not shout, she did not collapse. She left her coat on a chair, walked into the night air that smelled of cold and exhaust, felt the sting of December on exposed skin, and the absurdly bright sodium lamps turning the parking lot into a sheet of silver. She took a breath and decided to count to 3. Her backstory did not read like a melodrama. She had been the child of a small-town accountant who taught her how to keep books and how to find value where others saw noise. She had moved at 19 to the city with a scholarship, studied finance and later law, paying tuition with internships and with evenings cataloging ledgers for a firm that smelled of old paper. She had built her career on clarity and on being underestimated. At 29, she had been headhunted into wealth management. At 30, she had closed a hostile acquisition that rescued an ailing textile firm and turned it into a profitable division. She married once she believed she could afford softness, and for years she kept both softness and rigor in parallel. The partnership with her husband, Julian Merritt, had been an arrangement of minds as much as hearts. He had charm and the rare instinct of a dealmaker. He had declared himself an investor of scale and had access to capital she admired. She had brought into that marriage not only affection, but the discipline of accounting, the insistence that every agreement be recorded, that prenuptial terms protect accessible capital, and that any major asset transfer pass through a board or at least the council of trusted advisors. She had learned, painfully and gradually, that her patience had been a currency she was spending without ledger entries from others. That patience, once a virtue, had been the thing that let a private betrayal calcify into public rupture. Julian's backstory was shorter but dense with entitlement. He had grown up in a lineage where reputation was leveraged like credit, where introductions opened doors more persistently than skill. He became a billionaire by being first to trust his own instincts and last to owe apologies. He cultivated a face for photos and a manner that made investors sign papers without demanding full due diligence on passenger lists. He had cultivated a string of relationships that functioned as PR as much as intimacy. He believed law and prenuptial language were for people less clever than him and had a small army of advisors who smoothed paperwork after choices were made. He never understood that someone who kept the books could one day close accounts on him. His lover, Mara Devlin, was younger, magnetic, and a curator of moments. She brought a frenetic intensity that disoriented the kind of man who preferred certainty but craved newness. Between Julian and Mara, the seed of this betrayal had been planted, nurtured, and announced with gilded flourish. The first hours after the announcement were an odd mix of confusion and immediate professional assessment on Claire's part. She drove to the office while the snow turned the city into a monochrome painting, the heater working on a rhythm that smelled faintly of melted coffee. At her desk, she sat with a single lamp on, the world outside muffled by snowfall, and called 3 people in the space of an hour. "Evan," she said to her longtime corporate lawyer, "I need to know my options." He answered with the kind of soft voice that had handled crisis before. "Claire," he said, "stay put. Do not transfer anything tonight. Send me the prenuptial agreements and any signed resolutions." She spoke with Mara, a distant, wrong name that landed like sand in her mouth, but she kept it audibly steady, as she set in motion the legal scaffolding that would become her strategy. "Call me when you have the documents," she said to Daniela, her accountant, and then she dialed Mark, a former board colleague now at a private equity firm. Each call had its exchange, and each exchange loaded the atmosphere with decisions. Evan advised immediate steps. Daniela began to trace asset flows and promised to flag any unusual transfers. And Mark, always the networker, mentioned a contact at a bank who could lock accounts pending compliance reviews. The word prenuptial arose like a talisman at each stop. This was not about vengeance in the first few hours. It was about containment, about converting pain into procedural motion. The plan that began in that bright, cold office was surgical. She convened Evan and Daniela and Mark at 9 the next morning in a conference room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and leather chairs. The windows showed the city in a gray wash. "We need to prepare for a board vote," she said. "We need an immediate audit of any transfers affiliated with Julian's passive ventures and a freeze on any discretionary distributions pending due diligence." Evan nodded. "We will draft a motion for the board. We will invoke clauses relating to fiduciary responsibility and potential conflicts of interest." Daniela pointed to spreadsheets, the soft hum of the projector filling the room, and said, "The capital movement for the last 18 months has patterns that suggest third-party entities tied to Julian's network. If we move quickly, we can prevent any dissipation." They spoke in brisk sentences that cut like clean knives. "We will need to be discreet," Mark said. "No leaks or the press will turn this into something grotesque." Claire listened, counting each word as if it were a tool. She had been humiliated in a social moment. She would respond in corporate grammar. That same day, she made phone calls to 3 institutions, 1 bank, 1 private auditor, and 1 compliance firm, and asked for immediate due diligence with letters of engagement and deadlines. The tone was cold and strategic. She did not give the reporter access to her vulnerability. Her inner voice repeated a short list: maintain control, protect capital, transform pain into leverage. The first public action came as a quiet administrative storm. At the emergency board meeting she called, the room smelled of cold coffee and ink. The board assembled with varying expressions: loyalty, curiosity, calculation. There were 10 of them in the room, including Martin Chen, the senior partner, Rachel Ortiz, the operations lead, Omar Shah, the head of legal, and Layla Park, the new independent director. Claire presented a packet thick with exhibits, graphs, annotated bank statements, timelines of transfers, and a redacted copy of a wire showing a large movement out of an entity tied to Julian. She spoke crisply. "We have material concerns regarding conflicts of interest that may expose the firm to reputational and financial risk," she said. "I move that the firm appoint an independent auditor, place any related party transactions under review, and suspend any transfers above a threshold until the audit concludes." The room responded with questions. "Claire, are you alleging misconduct?" Martin asked. "I am alleging there are enough irregularities to warrant a formal audit," she replied. "Do you have legal grounds to suspend distributions?" Omar asked. "Yes, we have fiduciary obligations," Evans said from the corner. "We will issue a temporary injunction," he added. Dialogue lengthened into a series of exchanges that were clinical and thorough. "What about Julian's role?" Rachel asked. "He is on leave pending review," Claire said. "This is necessary to protect shareholders." The board voted. The motion carried with narrow consensus. There were 10 exchanges and more in that meeting where every sentence tightened the noose around rumor and turned it into procedure. The reaction from Julian was a swift unraveling of his social script. He called friends and PR consultants, he sent texts to mutual acquaintances, and in a short time, the first public statements were released through channels he controlled. "I am heartbroken," read a carefully curbed message he released, where the grammar was meant to soften, not to explain. In the private realm, his calls to Claire were short and jagged. "Claire, please," he said through one conversation, voice filtered and uneasy. "Why did you go to the board?" she answered. "Because you moved funds without disclosure," she told him. "You have no right to freeze access," he shot back. "We have a fiduciary duty," she said. "This is not personal, this is governance," Evan explained in an email she forwarded. The lover, Mara, sent a text to Claire that read, in polite cruelty, "We are starting a family. Wishing you peace." That message arrived like a small, intentional wound. At the same time, Julian's allies began to distance themselves, the stock of his public image wobbling as news outlets smelled conflict. The censors of the market, the journalists, the private equity gossip columns all began to assemble the story into shapes. The humiliation of the initial announcement had been social and intimate. The response she chose converted that humiliation into institutional scrutiny. In the midst of this, Claire met a potential partner who would change the tactical possibilities of the next months. His name was Thomas Reed, a co-founder of a sustainable urban development firm that had been quietly profitable for a decade. Their first encounter was oddly mundane. He attended the emergency hearing as an observer, introduced by Mark, and afterward offered a coffee in a side room that smelled strongly of fresh espresso and wood. He was thoughtful, with a resume that read like a ledger of responsible acquisitions, and he proposed a new project, a mixed-use development that could convert an old mansion into a community resource center tied to affordable housing. "We need someone who understands capital and governance," he said. "Your background fits the model." Claire listened, tasting bitter coffee and the warm reassurance of a plan. "I have access to capital," Thomas said, "and to investors who want this to be social and profitable." They discussed term sheets. He explained structure and mezzanine financing, and she countered with concerns about zoning and licensing, which he received with interest. He had his own backstory that he revealed in measured fragments. He had started in small-scale community projects, had scaled responsibly, and had built a network of institutional investors who respected due diligence. He was not a romantic savior. He was an ally of capital and of commitment. Their negotiation was a dance of expertise and promise. It led to the first of many contracts that would be signed in the weeks that followed. While the legal machine turned and the partnership with Thomas formed, Julian's public implosion accelerated. He denied wrongdoing and then issued a statement that contradicted a later filing. The lover, Mara, lost her composure in an interview where she cried about her new child. And the narrative of betrayal took on the shape of a soap opera that journalists could not resist. There were scenes of him in the press being asked about board responsibilities, of him flanked by lawyers who spoke in guarded phrases about private matters. In private, he began to make mistakes. He attempted to move assets, and some transactions were flagged by the compliance firm Claire had engaged. One scene is seared in detail. He attempted late on a Friday to authorize a transfer from one entity to another through an old signatory channel. The bank froze the request because of the audit hold. He called in the middle of the night, the line crackling with wind and a voice sharp from bourbon. "Why is my transfer blocked?" he demanded. "Because the board placed an administrative hold," Evan replied. "You will hurt our partners," Julian said. "Then we will negotiate through counsel," was the reply. Those 2 or 3 minutes of exchange had the climatic quality of a soap opera and the legal gravity of a courtroom. He erupted in anger, and later, in a scene of private humiliation, he confided to a friend that he had underestimated her fiscal mind. The fall from grace began slowly but with visible tremors. As Claire and Thomas launched the first project, they began small and visible. They purchased, through a shell company that would later be revealed, the low-roofed house that had once been Claire and Julian's summer retreat. The acquisition was handled with patience and attention to zone restrictions, with lawyers handling permutai and with a benign-looking developer named Carlos Alvarez overseeing the initial feasibility. The smell of sawdust and fresh paint soon replaced the memory of champagne and perfume. The plan was not to hoard the property, but to transform it into a shelter for women re-entering the workforce, to couple affordable units with a training center and incubator space for small businesses. They announced a partnership model with 3 nonprofits and a local bank that offered a low-interest line of credit in exchange for community impact metrics. Each contract used prenuptial clauses and parity language as models for board agreements, because Claire wanted every part of the build to be audited and transparent. The first ribbon cutting felt personal and private at the same time. The old marble fountain was replaced with a community garden. The penthouse view that had once belonged to private memories now looked down on a courtyard filled with laughter and tools. The project began to generate revenue within months, and along with revenue came stories of women who found apprenticeships at the incubator. This transformation of a symbol of her humiliation into a living resource became a leitmotif in Claire's strategy. There were legal battles, as a matter of procedure and of principle. Evan filed a motion to examine certain trustee accounts, and the litigation unfolded in civil court, where the language of fiduciary obligation became weapon and shield alike. The description of the procedure must be clear in plain terms. A motion for preliminary injunction was filed to prevent the dissipation of assets while independent auditors performed due diligence. The court set a fast-track hearing with an evidentiary timeline of 30 days and ordered immediate disclosure of any related party transactions above a 6-figure threshold. Depositions were scheduled, bank subpoenas issued, and compliance audits launched. Each step was described to the public sparingly and to the board with more granularity. The legal scaffolding had the effect of creating both a firewall and evidence trail. It was technical and it was human at the same time. The technicality explained why Julian could not simply sign away money in the night. It explained why prenuptial clauses did not mean absence of recourse, and why shareholders had standing when governance was at stake. As the projects began to show metrics of success, the headlines shifted. From betrayal to building, read one in a weekend profile. The narrative arc became about reconstruction. The partner, Thomas, appeared in interviews, careful and modest, and spoke about development, licensing, and legacy rather than revenge. "This is not about score settling," he said to a reporter. "It is about creating a model." Claire herself maintained a measured public voice, occasionally appearing at donor events where she spoke about resilience and equity. Yet privately, she rehearsed conversations with Julian and with the board. There were scenes of confrontation where words cut and where silence spoke even louder. One evening, Julian arrived at her office unannounced, the rain making the street outside shine like mercury. He stood in the foyer, smelling of wet wool and regret, and said, "I am sorry." She looked at him and asked a question she had rehearsed. "Are you prepared to be accountable?" There were 10 exchanges in that meeting, where motives, admissions, and refusals were parsed. "I made mistakes," he admitted. "Mistakes do not undo harm," she said. And when he attempted to negotiate personal reconciliation by offering to transfer assets, she said, "This is not a check you can write and call even." The conversation was clinical and then shapeless, with the kind of back and forth that resembled arbitration more than intimacy. Her assent had tangible markers. The incubator reported 3 companies launched in 8 months and employment numbers that read like small victories. The acquisition of the summer house had been transformed into a registered nonprofit that offered curricula in bookkeeping, digital literacy, and small business management. Names like Maria, Samira, Tasha became linked to the center in press releases and in social media posts. At the same time, Claire secured a seat as an independent director on a transportation board and negotiated a minority stake in a redevelopment trust through an equity. That was discussed over a long meeting where coffee steamed and notepads filled with calculations. The word acquisition appeared in headlines alongside words like legacy and impact. The former mansion, renovated with attention to historic details and modern code, opened to a crowd buzzing with the smell of cinnamon and the clatter of cutlery at a fundraiser brunch. She walked through the rooms and felt the warm varnish under her fingertips and resolved to keep moving. But the story required a final public moment of closure to crystallize the arc. Claire decided that the most effective statement would be a public opening at the renovated site where she would invite stakeholders, residents, donors, and yes, the press. She prepared a speech for that evening that would serve to articulate the journey from humiliation to institution. The event logistics were painstaking. Invitations were mailed, the press list curated, speeches rehearsed, and a program printed with the names of donors and the schedule for the evening. She asked Layla Park to moderate a panel about women's economic empowerment and brought in Alana Ruiz, a former city councilor, to speak about zoning and community investment. Vendors were briefed on the menu, and the sound technicians tested microphones until the sound in the hall felt like a comfortable kind of echo. The ceremonial ribbon was to be cut at dusk under soft lights, with a choir to punctuate the moment. These preparations were as methodical as any deal memo she had ever signed. On the night of the opening, the hall smelled of roasting coffee and citrus, the audience murmured, and Claire stepped up to the microphone. Her speech was measured and intimate. There are moments when private life becomes public, and when pain becomes the soil for something else, she began. She then told in controlled voice part of the story of arrival and the sentence in the living room that had changed everything. She did not name names at first, she named feelings, the economics of neglect, and the grammar of trust. The press listened and then leaned in. There were flashes of cameras and the soft rustle of program pages. After the speech, Julian appeared at the back of the room with a bouquet, not as a claim, but as a tremulous attempt at reconciliation. There were two exchanges that made the room shift. He asked, "Can we talk?" She replied, "We already did, in other forms." The choir began to sing as the ribbon was cut, and the first resident walked through the doorway with a small child who smelled faintly of soap and cocoa. That image of the child and the redeemed doorway created a final sensory seal for the public narrative. Approximately one-third into the story, when the legal motion had been filed and the first acquisition secured and the board vote had passed, a direct invitation to the audience appears here in the script, because at this point viewers are invested and ready to engage. If this story moves you, think about what you would have done first. Share your sentence starting with "I would" and tell us if your first step would be legal, financial, or personal. Your words can help others who feel trapped or humiliated to see options they had not considered. Comment with practical steps you have taken or would take, and be specific enough that someone reading could take a second action tomorrow. These comments form a community resource and may guide future episodes that dig into legal documents and financial checklists. After you write your line, keep watching to see the strategic moves Claire made in the weeks that followed, and how those moves reshaped not only her life, but an entire neighborhood. The final conflict surfaced in a negotiation that would determine control of certain family trusts. Julian proposed a settlement that would keep him out of court, but would preserve some private benefits. Claire's advisors evaluated it and flagged long-term governance risks. In the days leading to the final settlement discussion, there were tense exchanges between councils, between board members, and between Julian and Claire themselves. "If we sign this, you will give up claims to certain distributions," Evan told Julian's counsel. "We are willing to settle for a structured transfer that includes an oversight committee," Julian's lawyer countered. At the table that day, the air was warm with human presence and cold with legal precision. There were 15 exchanges in total, as clauses were revised, as escrow terms were negotiated, and as a final clause established a community oversight board to ensure that any funds previously earmarked for private enrichment would be repurposed into social investment. In that room, Claire insisted on transparency and on a clause that required annual third-party audits and an explicit commitment to legacy funding for the incubator. The negotiation ended with an agreement that redistributed certain assets into a trust with oversight and converted the penthouse into a long-term lease that would fund scholarships for residents. That settlement was not revenge in the vindictive sense. It was a recalibration of power. The ceremony that sealed public redemption was filmed and replayed in segments across networks. Claire spoke about the numbers, about the first quarter where the new mixed-use project reached break-even, and about the number of residents who had moved into permanent placements from the incubator. She gave credit to partners who had believed in the project early. She also, with unusual directness, addressed the betrayal. "I will not ask you to forget," she said, "but I will ask you to witness that we can build from the ruins." The crowd applauded and the lights softened. The former private edges of her life had been worked into public architecture. The audience saw a narrative of transformation that was both personal and civic. 1 month later, the first epilogue unfolded. The shelter had welcomed 28 women and placed 16 in paid apprenticeships. The incubator had accepted its first 2 cohorts and had delivered workshops in bookkeeping and micromarketing. The trust had released its first round of funding to local small businesses. For Claire, this month was a mixture of fatigue and relief. She still received urgent calls at odd hours, and the litigation had not fully concluded. But the rhythm of the center, the sound of sewing machines, and the click of keyboards provided a persistent proof that the project was real. She continued to attend board meetings, to monitor due diligence reports, and to work with Evan on the final closure of the litigation. She found, in small moments, the capacity to taste coffee without the iron of adrenaline. The community started to circulate stories of women who could now afford to enroll their children in after-school programs funded by the project. The quantity of work was real, and the quality of impact began to register in municipal reports. 3 months later, the second epilogue revealed a deepening effect. Local press covered a profile on the incubator that highlighted 3 startups that had moved from idea to revenue. A small bakery, owned by a woman named Aisha, had hired 5 part-time employees and had become a stable supplier to a neighborhood cafe. The funding trust reported a positive first audit, and an independent evaluator recorded measurable outcomes related to employment and income uplift. Claire had been invited to speak to a consortium of women in finance about board governance and about how prenuptial clauses and corporate governance can be vehicles of protection and not merely legal formalities. She had begun to mentor other women who had faced betrayal, advising them on how to ask for professional audits and on how to negotiate protective corporate structures. Her emails filled with requests for advice, and she created a small, closed network that met monthly to share documents, to run due diligence workshops, and to offer referrals to reliable lawyers and accountants. The community impact numbers grew, and the public narrative shifted from scandal to pattern. The word legacy began to appear with regularity in articles that once used it sparingly. 6 months after the night she had heard those 3 cruel words, the final epilogue painted a picture of consolidation. The nonprofit had secured a multi-year commitment from a regional bank that would provide low-interest capital for an expansion into 2 additional neighborhoods. The trust had formalized an oversight council composed of residents, independent directors, and a municipal representative to ensure that investments remained accountable. Claire had negotiated a speaking series with a business school to teach governance, and the curriculum included a module on prenuptial clauses as instruments of asset clarity and protection. Julian's public profile had receded, and his wealth had been partially redistributed into the trust and into the legal settlement that funded scholarships. The incubator reported 50 placements directly attributable to its programming, and the refurbished property had become a beacon for redevelopment that prioritized inclusion. Claire, in quieter moments, walked the property in the late evening smell of eucalyptus and freshly baked bread from the bakery next door, and felt a steady kind of resolve. She had transformed humiliation into a structure that supported others. The conclusion is simple yet heavy with accumulated detail. 1 year from that night of snow, Claire was not the woman who had stood in the doorway with a champagne flute. She was measured by deeds and by the tangible numbers of conversion from loss to gain. The projects had generated revenue. The trust had funded scholarships, and the old summer mansion had become a center that housed training programs for dozens. She reflected on the lesson that power can be built quietly through process and precision. If you are in a place where your boundaries are being erased, know that structural remedies exist. Organize your documents, consult counsel, and consider transforming a personal wound into an institutional solution. The final image is of a doorway opened wide, light pouring out onto a community garden where children play and where adults learn to read profit and loss statements. The best revenge was not a headline, but a legacy that renamed pain into purpose. If this story inspired you, subscribe for more accounts of how women translate setback into long-term impact, and join a community that turns private injury into public good.